Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and on this Good Friday, I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing?
Good Friday, Michael. It's been a good Friday. Good Friday to everybody watching, listening. Who else is there? Commenting, subscribing. Don't forget to subscribe to Novara Media, of course. How are you, Michael? How's your day been?
Not bad, actually. Spoke to Paul Morland. We've got an interview of him coming up. Looking forward to speaking to Peter Oborne tonight as well, of course. Looking forward to speaking to you as well. Good Friday, the day Jesus died. Also the day of the Last Supper. Am I correct? Did that happen on the same day?
I don't know. I thought the Last Supper was the night before. But this is meant to be a somber occasion. I mean, we started the show by saying Good Friday, hello. It's not meant to be a jolly occasion. Easter Sunday, of course, is the day when families get together, have a great time. But Peter, I think it's Peter Hitchens today, very keen to emphasize that today is a day of somber reflection.
You were speaking to Peter. You were speaking to Peter Hitchens. I'm going to speak to Peter Oborne. Let's get on with this show. I'm going to speak to Peter Oborne about why David Lammy's recent meeting with his Israeli counterpart was done in secret. Also, the IMF, sorry, I can't speak today, has claimed in a new report that 70 is the new 50, and that boomers should stay in work longer. I speak to demographer Paul Morland about that. Meanwhile, China is helping its retirees to take more holidays to stimulate the economy. I know which vision of old age seems more appealing to me, the IMF version or the Chinese version. I would go with those holidays. Stay tuned for all of that.
If I were president, and I say this, I will end that war in one day. It'll take 24 hours. I know Zelensky well. I know Putin well. I would get that ended in a period of
You can break that deal.
100%. It would be easy.
That was Donald Trump speaking to GB News in 2023. He'd sort it out in one day, 24 hours, 100%. It would be easy. Well, Donald Trump is, of course, now president, and he has been so for 89 days. The Ukraine war, of course, shows no sign of stopping. And today, his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said this.
I think it's important to remind everybody that the Ukraine war is a terrible thing, but it's not our war. We didn't start it. The United States has been helping Ukraine for over the last 3 years, and we want it to end. But it's not our war. I want everyone to understand that. And the reason why I make that point is the president has spent 87 days at the highest level of his government repeatedly taking efforts to bring this war to an end. We are now reaching a point where we need to decide and determine whether this is even possible or not, which is why we're engaging both sides. As you know, Ambassador Witkoff has had not one, not two, but 3 meetings with Vladimir Putin to determine the Russian perspective on this and understand what it would take for them to end it. We've, through General Kellogg, myself, and others, have had repeated engagements with the Ukrainians. So we came here yesterday to sort of begin to talk about more specific outlines of what it might take to end the war, to try to figure out very soon, and I'm talking about a matter of days, not a matter of weeks, whether or not this is the war that can be ended. If it can, we're prepared to do whatever we can to facilitate that and make sure that it happens, that it ends in a durable and just way. If it's not possible, if we're so far apart that this is not going to happen, then I think the president's probably at a point where he's going to say, well, we're done.
So we've gone from, I can sort it out in 24 hours, it will be super easy, to this is a bit too difficult. If we can't sort it out soon, we're done. Those statements from Marco Rubio came after the US and Ukraine signed a memorandum laying the groundwork for a future deal which would guarantee the United States rights to Ukraine's mineral reserves. The signing of the preliminary agreement was announced in a post by Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Yulia Sviridenko. It was also signed by the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent after an online meeting. Those photos were posted by the Ukrainian side. Few details of what the deal or the memorandum signed today actually contains have been released, so we don't know really what was in it. Trump has said he intends to sign a full minerals deal next week. Aaron, I want to focus on the statement from Marco Rubio, as we don't know much about that memorandum. What do you think was the purpose of that? What's he trying to achieve by saying you've got days to work this out or we're getting out?
I think it's a notice of what's going to happen. I don't think it's do this, otherwise we're leaving. They are going to leave. There was that meme from both, a year ago, but also more recently, where you have people looking down on Zelensky from the past. You have people who effectively were, quote unquote, allies of the United States, but then who were left out to dry and ultimately destroyed as political figures. Some of them actually were killed. I'm not suggesting Zelensky's going to be killed, but, That's the pathway we're on. And this is the United States war. The United States repeatedly encouraged Ukraine to pursue membership of NATO, to pull away from the Russian sphere of influence, etc. Now, you can think that's good. You can think that's bad, justified, not justified, whatever. It was clearly something that was being pushed by the US State Department. It's now come at a certain cost to the US government, particularly with regards to the Republican Party, and their base no longer wishes to really pay for this war. And there we are. We've seen this picture many, many times before. I'm sure we'll see it again. But it's a lesson to any politician or political movement out there. Do not become dependent upon the largesse of Washington, because they are very, very happy to change their minds very, very quickly. I'll finish with this, Michael. There was no better ally of the United States in the Middle East than Shah Reza Pahlavi in Iran, of course, removed in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Here's the thing. The Americans didn't just fail to support him, whatever. They wouldn't even let him enter the country and remain in the United States for cancer treatment. He was a dying man. They wouldn't even allow him to remain in the United States the rest of his life. That's how the United States treats its friends. And this is a story as old as time. And I suspect we're about to see the same thing play out again with Ukraine, Kyiv, and Volodymyr Zelensky.
Bit of a sort of divergence, I suppose, but just to follow up on this. So I thought the Shah went to America for cancer treatment, and that was one of the sort of reasons why the Iranians sort of occupied the American embassy, because they thought that this was an outrage. Did they ultimately kick him out after he'd had some cancer treatment?
Basically. I mean, look, he was terminally ill, right? But as I understand it, he didn't die in the United States. He wanted American citizenship. He wanted political asylum in the United States. That was basically what he was hoping for, and he didn't get it. I should rephrase that. There was some treatment. He was going to die anyway. I think it was stage 4 cancer at that point. That's how the US treats its allies. They wouldn't even give him political asylum. So there you go. And I wonder, will the same thing happen to Volodymyr Zelensky? You know, if Volodymyr Zelensky has to leave Ukraine for whatever reason, do you really think Trump et al. Will give him asylum? He can become a permanent resident in the United States? I suspect they wouldn't, actually. It's an interesting thought experiment at this point. Where would he go? I suspect maybe Britain would have him, right? Or one of the European countries. I mean, this is how the United States treats its allies. We could do many, many, many other examples. I mean, the UK too, to some extent, not quite as bad. I mean, Muammar Gaddafi was doing deals with Blair and BP, and then 10 minutes later, David Cameron's bombing the guy along with the French. So it's a very treacherous path that the Ukrainians have found themselves on. But to repeat what I said earlier, this was a war encouraged by US foreign policy circles, not UN foreign policy circles, US foreign policy circles and the State Department repeatedly for a very long time, actually, throughout the 2000s. So, and now they've spent, 100 billion plus. They have an administration which doesn't like it. They're going to tilt their foreign policy interests and resources elsewhere. They want to allocate clearly to some kind of standoff with China. That's clearly how this is recalibrating. Sorry, Ukraine, you're not that interesting anymore. This happens time after time, and yet people still, for some reason, think they can depend on the United States. By the way, that's why the UK shouldn't depend on the United States. But our entire foreign policy establishment, a media and political class, thinks that Atlanticism is sensible. It's not. It's insane. It is insane. Do not try and depend on the US. You'll probably end up in a very bad situation.
One of the things that this has got me thinking, and I suppose especially because it's so different to what Trump said in the run-up to the election, is just how bad this administration is. I don't mean bad morally, I just mean sort of in terms of competence. And how this, I think, is just massively accelerating the decline of US empire. I mean, it's more obvious with the trade war, because obviously the United States and China are in some form of competition. Now, I think it's more competitive than it needs to be because of certain ideologies around Washington at the moment in both parties. But they are in some kind of strategic competition. Trump started a trade war which was so badly managed that he has massively accelerated the extent to which, or accelerate the timescale on which China looks set to, I suppose, become the global hegemon, because they're just more trustworthy than the United States. And then this issue with Ukraine, I do think there could have been a case to say we need to bring about a peace deal sooner than Biden would have done. We need to sort of force Ukraine to make some compromises so that we can then shed loads of pressure on Vladimir Putin to end this war. But when it comes to trade, when it comes to Ukraine, there was in both of those examples actually a sort of series of decisions that the Trump administration could have made that would have been defensible and would have made some sense. But it's just been such chaos, like such a mess, that I do think, the Trump administration is accelerating sort of American decline as the world hegemon by probably about 20 or 30 years. I don't know, what do you think about that, Aaron?
I think that's probably true. By the way, George W. Bush did the same thing. If you look at the share of Western GDP as an overall share of global GDP, in 2000, it was the pinnacle, the year 2000. About 4/5 of global economic output was in the West, so the United States and its allies. I mean, extraordinary. Today, it's 3/5. So you've gone down from 4/5 to 3/5, which is obviously still a lot, but we know this is not a new proposition. Economic power, and as a result, political power flowing east from the Atlantic to the Pacific. I do think, though, that we're seeing something else again. So I think a very similar process in terms of accelerating that demise. And I think you're absolutely right. And it raises really important questions, actually, for people that believe in democracy. China as an autocratic state, it's not a critique of China, it just is. It's not, no multi-party system and, universal suffrage. You don't have those things in China. Is that political system better equipped to A, address long-term challenges, looking at a time frame of 20, 30, 40, 50 years, rather than the next electoral cycle or the next media cycle, the next 24 hours, the next day's newspapers? And is it also a more reliable trade and military partner, ally? Because again, its political elites aren't being, going from pillar to post as a result of domestic political pressures, concerns, volatility, etc. Now, I like the multi-party system. I like democracies, and I like living in a democracy, by the way. I think we can improve our democracy in this country significantly, but I think the sort of Nordic democratic model is fabulous. I think it's very, very good. I think it's probably the most progressive political system that humanity has yet devised. I think it probably peaks in somewhere like Sweden in the 1980s. Now, what we're seeing with China being such a stable ally, such a stable economic partner, being able to also address problems over a very long period of time, having that level of foresight, that's a real challenge to democracies and people that believe in democracies, Michael. Huge challenge. So it's not just a challenge to America and its hegemonic status, I agree with you there, but it's the very principle of democratic government as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat broken. If you want to learn more about China, I did an interview earlier in the week with Ku Jin, a Chinese economist. It's on about 300,000 views. You people are clearly very interested in this topic. I am too, so I'm delighted that we get to talk more about China and it's performing well on YouTube. So do check that interview out if you haven't already. A British Foreign Secretary meeting their counterpart from another country is normally an occasion that comes with a press release and a photo opportunity. And if the visiting minister comes from a country at war or with a controversial human rights record, there will usually be plenty of media interest. But when David Lammy met the Israeli foreign minister in London this week, it was done in secret. And it would have remained a secret had it not been for a story based on multiple sources in the Middle East Eye. The visit by Gideon Saar had been planned for March, but did not go ahead after Israel ripped up the ceasefire agreement it had with Hamas and renewed its assault on Gaza. And his meeting with David Lammy comes just a week after the UK Labour government criticised the Israeli government for deporting 2 Labour MPs. So you can see why Labour might have wanted to keep the meeting quiet. But that doesn't explain why the British press, even after the meeting was revealed in the Middle East Eye, decided to turn a blind eye. Well, that's the question reporter Peter Oborne has tackled in his latest column for the Middle East Eye. So he says, why did UK media ignore Lammy's secret meeting with Israeli foreign minister? To tell me the answer, I'm now joined by Peter Oborne. Peter, thank you so much for joining us again on the show. I suppose before we get to the media question, can we just start by asking you for a bit more background? What do we know about this meeting between David Lammy and Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar?
We still don't know very much because there's been when I last looked, there was no press release, no announcement, no briefing, certainly not on the record from the British Foreign Office. As quite often happens, and this is a significant feature in the reporting of the Gaza war. There's been more about it in the Israeli press, which is more interested in much more curious about what's going on. Even the official, even pro-war Israeli press, you'll get more about what's happening. And so they say there was a talk about Iran, I think about the nuclear situation there, which is another matter of vast consequence, which you would have thought that any energetic British foreign correspondent or foreign reporter would want to get their teeth into. So we don't know really what happened. We now know that there was a meeting with the shadow foreign secretary and Mr. Saar, Priti Patel, and I think he had a meeting with the Board of Deputies, which was reported by the BBC, which is another BBC shambles, I'm afraid, having sort of gone along with the matter about Mr. Saar's visit, then reported that the meeting with the Board of Deputies took place in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. And the BBC, I think, has had to correct itself on that matter. But so we don't know really what was discussed, and we do know though that this, as you say, is a matter of momentous significance. You know, there's the collective punishment going on in Gaza, the total cutting off of humanitarian aid. Wouldn't you have thought that they wanted to know how Mr. Saar wanted to justify that and what Mr. Lammy felt about it? He must be outraged, appalled at this collective punishment, this war crime which is going on in Gaza at the moment. You would have thought, there are so many questions about the belligerent status taken by Israel towards Iran, and are we going to go into what could easily turn into World War III? But no, the British newspapers were happy to allow the Saar visit to take place as if there'd been a D-notice about it. And there wasn't a D-notice as far as I know, but they knew that they must have known that he was here, but they were happy to go along with the Foreign Office idea that this is a private visit. When the Guardian, which is the one mainstream British paper, which actually went off and followed it, they were told by the Foreign Office, "Oh, it's a private visit. It's so private that that it's not a private visit. It's not friends and family. That would have been a different thing." And why does the British media, mainstream media, have to follow the agenda of the British Foreign Office, which wanted to hush it up? And I think that's pathetic. I think it's shameful. I don't think it's as journalism ought to be practiced.
And from the perspective of the government, I mean, is it unusual for them to invite a foreign minister and not do a press release? I mean, is the idea of a private meeting something which does happen often, whereby a government minister says, I want to meet my foreign counterpart, I suppose, and we don't want this to be publicised. Is that normal, or is this a sort of unusual occurrence that took place this week?
There are always informal channels between governments, including, so that happens all the time. But when the foreign minister of another country comes to Britain and goes into the Foreign Office and has a meeting with the British Foreign Secretary, you would expect there to be a statement about it, and often a joint press conference. And so, and certainly there would be a press release that this has happened. And no, none of this has happened. That has been hushed. So that makes it a secret meeting, which is unusual. I don't think that normally a British Foreign Secretary meets his counterpart abroad, and it's a quiet matter which is kept hush-hush. Imagine if Lavrov had come in, right, from Russia on the same basis, and it hadn't been announced, and there hadn't been any statement. The British press would have been all over this. They'd have said, this is a major. Why is the meeting between Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and the British foreign minister being kept on hush hush? They'd have made a fuss. They'd have swarmed the Foreign Office.
And I mean, let's open up this conversation a little bit. I want to know your assessment of the Labour government and how they have dealt with, or not dealt with, I suppose, Israel when it comes to its genocidal onslaught on Gaza. I mean, we've spoken on this show recently about how they're often willing to tweet condemnation for certain actions of the Israeli government, but never really want to go beyond tweeting their condemnation. Everything else sort of stays the same. And I suppose, from your perspective, has this Labour government been any different from the Tory government that they replaced when it comes to Israel and their war on Gaza?
In some ways, the Starmer government did do 3 course corrections, all of which were very welcome when it came into power after last year's general election. The first thing was that quite shamefully and disgracefully, the Cameron government was, no, sorry, I say Cameron, the Cameron as foreign secretary, the Sunak government was trying to block the ICC arrest warrant investigation into Netanyahu. Then the next thing they did, and that stopped under, Starmer threw his weight behind the ICC. That was very welcome. The next thing was, you may recollect that the Sunak government suspended funding to UNRWA, which is the major, effectively, the major humanitarian aid provider in Gaza. Quite disgracefully, really shamefully, the Sunak government had ended funding. It's been reawakened by Starmer. And finally, on the matter of arms sales, which at last, citing fears about international humanitarian law, which is the polite term for war crimes, is the British government suspended a very small number of the Starmer government of arms contracts. And so they did three things. But what they haven't done is haven't gone further. I mean, at the moment, what is happening now in Gaza is collective punishment and the starvation, what looks like the starvation now of the Palestinian people. You hear this rather decorous clubland language. We condemn it. We're looking for better. But Britain, there are amazing things that Britain can do. This is a war crime. We could now say, right, we're suspending all arms sales. We're going to look at sanctions, and we don't get any of that. We get basically a slightly sniffy tolerance of what Israel is doing in Gaza now.
What is your analysis of what Israel is doing in Gaza now? Obviously, there was a brief ceasefire. We now seem to be back to sort of a full-scale onslaught. I mean, one of my concerns is that sort of the world's media attention is on Donald Trump's constant press conferences, and that maybe means that Netanyahu thinks he has a bit more leeway to sort of carry out his maximalist aims, which was to essentially clear Gaza of Palestinians. I mean, what do you think's going on at the moment?
Well, I think it's right from the start of this. It's been going on now for 18 months, this Israeli assault on Gaza. The Israelis themselves have been completely candid about what they're doing, which is the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. And many of them are saying they want to kind of get rid of the Palestinians from Gaza. And we've had conferences about the resettlement of Gaza by Israelis. And we're now having the ethnic cleansing of large parts of Gaza, which is a tiny place the size of East London, and the people are being kicked out of areas and moved into smaller areas. And so this is the continued attack and forcing out of people into smaller and smaller areas. There's lots of evidence that they want actually to get them out into Sinai or into get into other countries. This is ethnic cleansing. It's a war crime, and that is what they want to do. And I think we just have to. That's judging by the statements made by senior Israelis.
By their statements and their actions. Peter Oborne, thank you so much for joining us again on Novara Live this evening. The IMF has released a new report claiming that 70 is the new 50. The paper has been widely picked up in the UK media by newspapers such as The Telegraph, whose many older readers might not be too keen on the push to keep them working. This is from The Telegraph's write-up of that IMF report. The world's lender of last resort has said older people today are far sharper and stronger than they were 25 years ago, meaning they should stay in employment for longer. It released its findings after data from 41 countries revealed remarkable leaps in healthy lifespans. They found that someone aged 70 in 2022 had the same cognitive function as the average 53-year-old in 2000, placing them far ahead of the noughties septuagenarians. The research is based on detailed surveys of 1 million people aged 50 and older, testing functions such as memory, orientation, and basic maths, tests of strength, and lung function also found physical health has significantly improved, with 70-year-olds boasting the same fitness as 56-year-olds 25 years ago. Now, people being healthy for longer is undoubtedly good news. Brilliant. The IMF, though, comes bearing bad news as well. This is from the Telegraph again. The fund warned that debt-laden governments cannot afford to let growing swathes of fit and sharp older people lean back and enjoy a long retirement. Instead, they must be encouraged to keep working to offset a growing imbalance between workers and retirees. The IMF said demographic forces seem to be casting long shadows over prospects for living standards and public finances. And it said the combination of plunging birth rates and people living longer will contribute to knocking 1.1 percentage points off global growth each year for the next quarter of a century compared to the pre-pandemic average. And the fund argued, this is the bad news bit, that to ease fiscal pressures caused by an aging population, governments must look to overhaul pension ages, slash early retirement benefits, and encourage workers to delay their retirement. To discuss these proposals and this report from the IMF, I spoke earlier to leading demographer Paul Morland. Paul is Associate Professor at Birkbeck and author of many books, including The Human Tide and No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children. I began by asking Paul whether the IMF is right that ageing populations mean we need to work for longer.
They do. You might pose the question the other way round. Will working longer solve the problem of ageing populations? So without a doubt, as we try and solve the problem of lots and lots of old people not working, requiring pensions, healthcare, social care, fewer and fewer young people in the workforce to do the jobs and pay the taxes, as we face that problem, what are the solutions? And no doubt one of the solutions is changing the retirement date and working longer. And as the IMF points out, we are younger than we were at any given age, physically, more alert and more compos mentis and more physically fit. However, I think, and for reasons we may explore, that as a solution to the problem of ageing is going to be very limited.
We'll get onto that as to whether even if this were implemented, that would sort of solve the problems of an ageing society. I suppose before we do that, though, there are certain jobs, obviously, where I think it would be difficult to ask people to work beyond 65. There are lots of people where, even if they live longer than they did before, I think people's health does still start deteriorating pretty significantly after 65. And the idea that sort of we're asking people to work later and later in their lives, it does seem a bit perverse. You're certain that this is necessary?
Well, if we don't do it, we will suffer more and more from the problems of the support ratio, which is basically the number of people of working age to those of retirement age. It's going to happen. The state is not going to be able to support people. People will be forced to do it. Whether the state tries to keep the kind of welfare and old age provisions in place that we have or not, effectively people are going to be forced to do it, and people will be slightly more capable. One thing I would say about the IMF report, they make a lot of play about how much we are getting fitter and able to work longer. But that data is global, and if you actually scratch beneath the surface, from the best I can make out from the IMF data, and it makes sense, most of those gains in the last 25 years at a global level have come because hundreds of millions of people in countries like China and India, many parts of Africa, have got better health, better nutrition, more healthcare. So most of the gains are those sorts of countries catching up with the kind of longevity and the kind of long health that we've had in countries like Britain. In countries like Britain, however, the gains are very small, and in some cases reversing. We're not expanding our life expectancy very long, and we've got 4 million people claiming some kind of health benefit. So I think it's illusory to imagine that in the countries that are really going to suffer from labour shortages because of ageing, those countries that have very low fertility for a long time, which are the developed countries, that the improvements are that great. So I think the IMF overplays that. I think it will be necessity that drives people to work longer. And I think it is a hard ask in many cases. For example, for sure, in the physical work, it's harder and harder as you get older. But also in the cognitive area, even if you are very cognitively alert, the changes in the workplace are so rapid and so technologically driven that I can tell you from experience, it's quite difficult for someone in their 50s, now a distant memory for me, to keep up with a modern office place, with its terminology, with its technology, with its shifting ideologies. It's actually not a very conducive place for someone in their mid-late 50s, early 60s to be.
Doesn't technology come into this story in a different way, though? Because, I mean, we can look back to someone like Keynes, who said that sort of productivity growth should mean that in the future, I think he sort of said in the medium term, people will be able to work 15-hour weeks. Now, we've had, since he said that, so much technological advances, so much increases to productivity. Yes, it's slowed down over the past decade or so, but we still have compared to 50 years ago or something. So is there not a case that the advance of technology, the increase in productivity, should have meant that we could have dealt with a sort of increasing dependency ratio in a way other than telling people to work longer? Could we not have had a different economic fix whereby we said, actually, maybe if we just share the benefits of productivity growth more fairly, we can all, in fact, work less, not more?
Well, Keynes, I think, talked about the economic prospects of our grandchildren, and he died in the 1940s. So it's definitely high time we were in that Keynesian paradise. And it is interesting why it hasn't happened. I think it hasn't happened for two reasons. First of all, the living standards in his day were very, very high compared, say, to the 1860s. And it felt like particularly working class living standards were so much higher back in the 40s than they had been when he was a child or when his parents had been children, that the thought was, well, that's kind of as good as it's going to get for the masses. And with productivity gains, they'll be able to work less. In fact, our expectations, our standard of living have risen enormously, so that going back to anything like that kind of standard of living would be unimaginable for most people. So our material expectations have caught up with the economic growth to a large extent. So as we've made those productivity gains, we bank them in terms of higher life standards, living standards, and we've kind of grown to expect those. The other thing is this extraordinary fact that in the last 20, 30, 40 years, every new wave of technology has promised us productivity gains, that is, gains in economic output per hour worked. And we simply haven't seen it. It was when I started in the workplace, it was these new things called personal computers and fax machines, and then it was going to be the internet. When I started working, we couldn't even send emails. Now it's going to be AI, and there have been lots of things I've missed in between. And I think all these things profoundly change society. They change the workplace, and they change the nature of work. But they don't seem to be turning us into a world where we can have an economy of the sort of size we've got today with half the labour force. And one of the things that's happening is the aging of society. As society ages, more and more jobs need to be very hands-on. I mean, I've just been at the old age home visiting my mother, and the technology being used there is very little different from what it would have been 40, 50 years ago. Young people who need to import washing machines or fridges to found their new homes, the productivity gains there are great, but as you get an older society, so much hands-on labour is required. It's not obvious that that's productively different from how it would be in a generation or two generations ago.
I suppose in terms of why we didn't get to the Keynesian paradise of working less instead of more, I see what you're saying in terms of he might not have been able to sort of foresee the expectations, even though we've got, we had a brilliant smartphone 10 years ago. People still wanted a better one. And TVs kept getting bigger and flatter, whatever. But there is also a reason why people kept having to work long hours, which was related to necessity, not to sort of desires and expectations, which is that rent continued to get more expensive, housing continued to get more expensive. There are sort of certain aspects of life whereby sort of the quality of life of people hasn't really improved. And that to me does seem to be more a case of how our economy and society is organized, as opposed to we just have to keep working more because people's expectations are limitless. I feel like if we had a system whereby you didn't have to spend quite so much on housing, on rent, then people wouldn't have to work longer hours. They wouldn't have to work longer years. And we might be able to sort of share the gains of productivity growth a bit more fairly than we have managed to do so far. I mean, what do you make of that?
The whole planning and NIMBY process in this country makes it very difficult for young people to get on the housing ladder, as we know. And this government's trying to do something about it, not nearly enough and not nearly quickly enough. And as the parent of 3 kids, I'm very conscious of how important it is for people to get on the housing ladder and start their families. And the inability of people to do that is itself one of the causes of our very low fertility rate and our very rapid aging. So that's part of the story. I think another part of the story is that the economy is growing less and less every year. We're not producing more, not producing more per hour. And I think people do expect a standard of living that is going to grow and grow and grow. And I think that creates tensions And I think it creates frustrations. I think it creates expectations that aren't met. And that doesn't create the kind of conducive society in which people are going to start families and reverse this demographic problem. But I'm not sure that a sort of socialist paradise, and I know that's not what you're talking about, but it may be what you mean. But I'm not sure we could design a socialist paradise or pull down capitalism and find we suddenly have high fertility rates and we've solved the problem. I mean, these problems were very profound in the socialist countries in Eastern Europe. It's not as if having a non-capitalist system, whether you're talking about China or Cuba or Vietnam, is going to guarantee you against very low fertility rates. And of course, you may say, well, China's not the kind of socialism I'm talking about. Cuba's not the kind of socialism I'm talking about. There's always some theoretical model which might solve the problem, but I'm not aware of any economic system in the world today which guarantees you a decent fertility rate.
We've mixed up two issues in a way here, because I was more talking about whether a different economic system could allow us to sort of move into a system where we have a worsening dependency ratio. So more people who are not in the workforce, who are of pension age or children, compared to the people who are of working age. I was suggesting that in a different economic system, we might be able to resolve that by just distributing the gains of productivity growth, as opposed to making everyone who does work harder and longer, if you see what I'm saying. The fertility I do want to get onto, though, because the question of AI, I'm very interested in the sort of fertility topics you write about and you talk about. I also listen to a lot of podcasts and read lots about AI. And you've got these two conversations going on at the same time, often actually by the same people. So someone like Elon Musk is very sort of represented in both of these groups, where you've got people talking about AI saying this is just going to destroy so much work. So many people's jobs are going to become redundant because it is going to be able to do them. And then you've got the fertility people saying we're going to have a worsening dependency ratio. We're not going to have enough people to do jobs. And I wonder what you sort of make of these two discourses going on at the same time that seem to have completely contradictory concerns. One saying there aren't going to be enough people to work, and the other people saying there aren't going to be enough jobs.
Elon Musk is on both sides of these arguments. So on the one hand, he says we're heading for a calamity without enough children. And on the other hand, he thinks AI will be able to pick up all the work. And I think I haven't spoken to him, I don't know him, so I don't know how he'd reply to it. But I think one of the things he might say is, yes, he believes that AI will replace all the work, but it's a tragedy if we age as societies, if we lose the possibility of having children. And, I often talk about the economic consequences. I think there's a whole set of reasons for having children. The joy of parenthood, and now for me, grandparenthood, is an amazing thing, and you can kind of wax lyrical about it. Even if AI solved the labour problem, we'd still have that issue. But I don't think AI will solve the labour problem. And I'm not a technology expert, but those many who are say that if you actually understand the maths involved and the computing power involved, AI is going to change a lot of what we do and come up with a lot of clever solutions. But there's so much that goes on in the economy today, from, as I always say, bin collection to brain surgery, where AI is going to make very, very little difference. If you look around the world, you look what people are actually doing, there are always things that new technology will change or replace. But it's not obvious to me that AI is going to make that much difference. Again, another example I give is I needed a new roof on my house, and I saw the chaps turn up in a van, and they put on the tiles, and they used electricity. They did a load of things. Maybe the tiles are slightly more efficiently manufactured than they were. They did a load of things which I think AI is a million miles off being able to do. And they wouldn't have done it that differently 50, 60, 70 years ago. We can see this vortex of falling fertility rates and cohorts, 2/3 in the UK, 1/3 in Korea, the size of the last one. And on the other hand, we've got this nice promise of driverless cars and all sorts of things we're endlessly promised. It's always a few years away, and it never seems quite to transpire. AI is real, it's happening, it's having an effect. I don't see it replacing labour in a very significant way, and certainly not to the extent that will be required as our populations shrink at the rate they will do.
We're in an interesting position, or we're in a position which presents a challenge, right? So the dependency ratio is going to get worse. We're going to have fewer people of working age compared to older people. Now, there are sort of three different solutions around, I think. So one is to say technology is going to resolve it. The other, which I was sort of intimating towards before, was saying maybe if we had a different economic system where we focused more on redistribution, we could resolve it. And you're saying actually the best way to resolve it is to increase the birth rate. I find your argument very interesting. I don't sort of reject it. But, I mean, you've suggested the first two are unlikely to work. Many people would say that your third solution is unlikely to work because while it may be desirable to increase the birth rate and to have more kids, for a number of reasons, I agree with you that I think sort of having children brings lots of people joy. I actually personally worry that, lots of people in 20 years' time might think, oh God, I wish I had a kid when I was in my 20s or 30s. I think that's a serious possibility. But the practical policy implications of that are unclear because as far as I understand it, people who have offered tax breaks for parents, so say in Hungary, or people who have tried to sort of subsidize childcare, so say in the Scandinavian states, they might be good policies. They haven't dramatically increased the birth rates and not to an extent which is going to resolve the worsening dependency ratio. So why should we take your proposed solution as more realistic than the other solutions which people propose to this problem?
Well, I think partly because it would be the best way out of the problem, a better and more positive view of the future, full of young people, whatever the economic system, full of young people, full of promise, full of hope, than trying to design our way out and have a big old age home run by robots, to be honest, as one way. Or your idea of some redesigned economic system, not entirely, hike up taxes, so which will probably destroy enterprise and destroy the economy, but maybe replace it with some kind of undefined socialist system or whatever. Somehow transfer the fact that we can create all this wealth to maybe a lower living standard or a different sort of living standard, which I'm skeptical about for a whole set of reasons. I mean, we could all live in the 1960s living standards. I don't think people are prepared to go to that. I think what we've never tried in Britain is actually talking about this subject enough. As we were discussing the other night, we've never had a politician of front rank talk about it. Keir Starmer's the first one to talk about it. And he says, none of my business, mate. So we've not even started to try in Britain. And in the countries that have tried, they've tried various policies. And there is some evidence that they've worked. The baby bonus in Australia in the early 2000s, the subsidized childcare in Norway, at the end of the 20th century. There's some quite social scientific work that suggests these things will work. They'll work, different things will work at different times in different places. I think you've got to throw the whole kitchen sink at it. If you take this problem as seriously as I do, you've got to throw the whole kitchen sink at it and completely reorientate the ideology, the tax system, the culture. I think it's got to be absolutely thoroughgoing in a way that is pronatal, that puts families at the heart of it and doesn't associate that with some kind of handmaiden's tale or going back to the 1950s. We've got together to forge a progressive view of a society that culturally, economically, from the point of view of tax and spend, and from the point of view of people's aspirations, reorients itself towards producing its own future. And I think we've only started on that journey. We should have started 50 years ago. The fact that people like you and me and Matt Goodwin and Aaron Bastani across the spectrum are talking about this, I think together we can make this happen. We just have got to cast aside some of the taboos and see what we can do. We've got to experiment. We've got to learn lessons from overseas. And if we do that, I think we're in with a chance. I wouldn't throw in the towel at this stage.
I suppose, because I've been a bit vague, I suppose in terms of economic solutions, I would say something along the lines of making housing incredibly cheap, either via socialization or just building shed loads of it with state support, presumably, and then to some degree socializing the profits, which I think are going to accrue to the AI and tech sector, and maybe having some sort of universal basic income or universal basic services, which means that we can afford to live a little better without constantly grafting and grinding. I'll go to you for final thoughts. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but it's been very interesting talking to you today.
In terms of cheap housing, I think that's really important, and I think we need non-market solutions to that. The problem is that there are parts of the world, even parts of the UK, where housing's relatively cheap and the fertility rate is still very low. So to focus on one thing like housing and think that will crack it is delusional. We need a thoroughgoing cultural change, and there absolutely need to be economic changes in the mix as well.
That was Paul Morland speaking to me earlier today. Aaron, I know this is a topic that excites you, aging. whether or not we'll have to work longer. What did you make of that interview? What did you make of this IMF report?
Well, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? The idea that you could pay decades of national insurance contributions and you effectively don't get to retire. That's basically what's being said. I mean, if you get to retire at 75, I mean, there's not really much point in that. Let's be quite honest. There's also a bit of a feedback loop here, Michael, because grandparents are incredibly important in helping to rear children. And of course, if grandparents remain in the labour market for longer, that is another counteracting factor which will impede people having kids and keeping the fertility rate lower. So, the idea that, if people just work longer, then that will help the problem. Well, I think lots of people out there, I certainly, if we didn't have my wife's mother, we wouldn't be able to have one child, let alone two, right? Let alone three. So I don't think there's a free lunch in any of this. There's a lot to sort of respond to in what Paul was saying there. I do disagree with you, Michael, that these policies haven't worked. France, for instance, made big interventions in the 1930s, not all of which I agree with, by the way. But it set it up very well for the post-war period to have the highest fertility rates in Western Europe. To this day, it has, I think, some of the best fertility rates in Western Europe because of the wraparound support it offers young families, particularly women. So there is evidence of state intervention being able to function. Yes, Hungary's fertility rate has stayed around 1.4 for the last 10 years, but Britain has gone from like 2 to it's getting below 1.4, whereas Hungary's stabilized. Maybe that's all we can actually aim for, right? Is if you have sufficiently socialized childcare, very generous housing, policies. You might make changes to the tax system. I don't really see much evidence that working, but you might do that. Basically, really big economic incentives to have more children. And yeah, maybe the best you can hope for is just flatlining 1.5, 1.6. But this is really key, Michael. The lower it gets, the worse it gets. The lower it gets, the worse it gets. So yes, of course, replacement is 2.1. But if you get to 1, then in the space of two generations, you go from 100 people to 25. That's a fertility rate of 1. So if each couple has one child, 100 people in the space of 2 generations becomes 25. Why does that matter? Well, because when you're 80 to 90 years old, you're going to need people of working age who are not just caring for you, I think ideally in a socialized elderly care system, but also paying the taxes to look after you and also to keep society ticking over. So there's a major, major problem here if you have a fertility rate significantly below 2.1, like I say, towards 1, while we have a significant minority of the population. By the way, in this country, life expectancy has stagnated, but of course, very wealthy people are living longer and longer and longer and longer, the oldest old. That has tremendous costs as well, people reaching 85, 95, 100, while your working age population shrinks. That's a huge challenge. You can't ignore that. So if you're a socialist, you need to care about that stuff because it's going to be core to the running of society. You look at someone like South Korea, a fertility rate of 0.8, in the space of 2 generations, Michael, you go from 100 people to, I think, 16. That does not function, doesn't work. You're not going to be able to look after people in their old age. When I'm 85, I want to be looked after. Thank you very much. So this is a really important subject which people should care about. I do think, and I agree with you, that technology will play a huge role. And I disagree with Paul that AI, isn't already here. Self-driving cars are already here. You can get a Waymo in San Francisco or in Austin. You can use an app and you can hail a driverless taxi. It's here already. I think they're going to expand to other places. I think they're going to Tokyo at some point in the next few years. So driverless cars are literally already here. Yes, it's in certain contexts, and to what extent will that become more mainstream? That's an open debate, but they're literally already here. I think the minute you have a technology or a machine capable of doing cognitive and physical work akin to a 10-year-old human, it's over, right? You don't have to have a super athletic, super intelligent machine to massively compress the price of manual labor. That doesn't have to happen. They can be really crap and it has massive impacts on the price of human labor. And that's going to create real problems in terms of inequality, in terms of mass poverty. And these are the things I talk about in my book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism. People should buy it on the Novara store, the Novara bookshop. But yeah, really, really fascinating, Michael. And I think socialists should really care about this subject. This should not be a right-coded conversation. Because, like I say, this is a global thing too, right? So you might be saying, oh, well, just have migration. 50% of the planet is below 2.1 now. I think the 20 largest economies in the world are below 2.1. India is now 2 in terms of fertility rate. Iran is below 2. China is obviously well below 2. So this is a global issue. The idea that you can just have people migrating and that'll sort it out. What, Iran has migration? China has so eventually, where are the migrants coming from? India has migration. So yeah, a huge conversation, and I think in the medium to long term, a really, really major challenge we've yet to even really think about.
We're going to stick with a similar topic and a more positive angle, actually, on the China question. To offset a reduction in exports to the US, the Chinese government needs its own people to spend more money. And just like much of the rest of the world, China has a rapidly aging population. So, how could the Chinese Communist Party resolve these two challenges in one go? Well, apparently, the answers are something called silver trains.
These party animals are being asked to head out and have a good time for the sake of China's economic future.
We have been working so hard for many years. So I'm 66 years old. So important thing is that when we reach this year, this age, we must know what is the right thing to do and must really enjoy our life.
This country is rolling out fleets of so-called silver trains, named this way because of the hair colour of the passengers.
我看那个是为什么有这个吗？
这个是一个安全把手。
We're shown the extra safety features.
这里有电话，然后可以通过这部电话。
Here we have 24-hour support.
我们还有一些智能。
We also have a virtual assistant.
可以叫他小杜，小杜，在哪？就可以给您提供帮助了。
In the bathroom, an emergency button. And on board, there are defibrillators and emergency kits.
外用药箱。
Morning comes and time for breakfast before the next stop.
So if you're wondering why sort of encouraging people to go on trains and spend money would work as an economic solution, the context here is partly that China, unlike, say, the UK, has a very high savings rate. So people, when they earn money in China, on average, 44% of it goes into a savings account instead of being spent. Now, in a way, that's good. That means that people have more money in their retirement. But if it doesn't get spent, it doesn't keep the economy moving. So the Chinese government want people to spend more. And this is what looks like a very lovely way of getting them to do it. The silver trains also serve another policy goal, though.
And it's the less developed destinations along the route which need a shot in the arm. So the travellers of years gone by are back.
When I was young, I really liked exploring other places by myself. Now I'm older. I have my family who can go with me.
On this occasion, her granddaughter has come along too. These trips alone are not going to fix China's problem with low consumer spending. Yet economists would say at least it's a step in the right direction. So heading back to the train, the silver adventurers can crash out, knowing that their big day out was, at least partly, for the benefit of all. Then it's on to the next town.
It's a very positive story about China from the BBC. What did you make of that? I mean, looks like a great public policy to me.
Looks great. And also, Michael, we're accustomed to thinking that China is the developing country, the United States is the developed country. The average person in China lives longer. They have a longer life expectancy. A Chinese male retires at around 60. That's before the average US male. Female, often below 60. So lower retirement. They live longer. And they have trains like that. And yet we still think it's a developing poor country and the Americans, know what they're doing. And this is out there in the lead. By the way, you're more likely to die as a woman in childbirth in the US than you are in Bosnia. And apparently that's the template the rest of the world is trying to imitate. It does make you think, Michael. You see these things, you think, maybe they're already a developed country. I mean, there's still lots of poor people in China. Sure, there's lots of poor people in the US as well.
So we've looked at one East Asian country that seems to be dealing with aging in a fairly positive way. There was another one from an IMF report about aging societies, and this is mentioning Singapore. This is from the Telegraph write-up, which I found somewhat inspiring. So the IMF researchers encouraged countries to look to Singapore. The country experienced a dramatic surge in life expectancy between 1950 and 2018, rising from 90th in the world rankings to first after experimenting with various policies. These include building widespread public fitness centres and subsidising housing near family to promote closer ties across generations. Aaron, every government should be promoting this, right? Building widespread public fitness centres and subsidising housing near family to promote closer ties across generations. I mean, this would serve two public policies in the UK, because we've actually got lots of sort of older people in these big houses, but they don't want to move out because they want to stay in their community. If you subsidise smaller flats for people, they can stay in their community and their families can move into their bigger houses. I want these big multi-generational families that you have in like some of the, Southern European countries. I think we need to bring that back, but not in the oppressive way. I think it needs to be in a more sort of in a way which is more associated with socialist abundance than Catholic guilt.
Well, I don't think we're going to get that, are we, Michael? People are talking about Singapore, a very well-ordered society. Some of that could be coded as right-wing, some coded as left-wing. Obviously, land in Singapore is entirely publicly owned. It's entirely nationalised land in Singapore. Our political and media elite thinks this just should be left to the market, Michael. So we've seen it for 45 years, and I think we'll probably see it for another couple of decades, frankly, until the country literally breaks apart at the seams. This is left to the market. The people that run the state in this country do not believe in the state. The people with political authority in this country do not believe in authority. The people tasked with, shaping the future of the UK and the people that live here, all 68 million people of us, they do not believe in shaping the future. It's politicians who don't believe in politics. So we can talk about nice solutions being pioneered by the Singaporeans and the Chinese. They're not going to do anything. They believe in shareholder value. They believe in perma-austerity. And they believe in inflation below 2%. That's it. Those are literally some political commitments of our political elite. That's it. And okay, the NHS doesn't fall apart. Let's just try and keep it just kind of, just about on its feet. That's literally how politics in this country works. So yeah, I agree. Let's have housing like Vienna. Let's have land policy like Singapore. Let's have high-speed rail like China. Sounds good. We could do all of it, by the way, but we have a political elite which is just so blinkered and insulated from solving problems. They don't want to solve problems. By the way, that's why they keep on creating new NGOs. That's why they love the Supreme Court. That's why they love the EU. It means they don't have to solve problems. They don't have to have responsibility. I think that's a real problem. I think it's something we need to change very, very soon.
I really like that as a manifesto. Housing policy, houses like Vienna, land policy like Singapore, and high-speed trains like China. I would definitely vote for that. Aaron, I can hear your child in the background. So I suppose it's quite fitting given the last two stories we covered on tonight's show. But I will let you get off to your bank holiday weekend. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure, Michael. I hope it didn't ruin people's listening. The baby should be upstairs. I don't quite know what's going on. My wife's playing games with the dog and the baby. We're trying to do a show, but there you are. It's Easter. We'll make allowances.
Okay. It's very good of you to make allowances. Let's wrap up there. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Have a fantastic bank holiday weekend. We will be back on Monday, though, for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.